The transport ship Meridian Dawn shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning under the stress of dimensional transition. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his face against the small porthole, watching as the alien world of Kepler 442b materialized before them. The planet's crimson surface was scarred with deep canyons and towering spires of crystalline formations that caught the light of its binary suns. "First time seeing an alien world, Marine?" asked Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, the mission's diplomatic envoy. Her voice carried the polished accent of someone who had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of interstellar politics. Marcus shook his head, his weathered face remaining impassive. "Third, actually. But this one's different. The Zephyrians chose this place for our little meet and greet for a reason." He gestured toward the harsh landscape below. "They want us to feel small." The Zephyrian hegemony had been humanity's primary rival since first contact 18 months ago. Where humans had clawed their way into space through determination and ingenuity, the Zephyrians had inherited a vast empire from their predecessors. Their technology was superior, their military was larger, and their arrogance was legendary throughout the known galaxy. This diplomatic mission was humanity's last chance to secure mining rights to the rare Earth elements on Proxima Centauri. Without those resources, Earth's expansion into the galaxy would grind to a halt. The Zephyrians knew this, and they had been systematically blocking human access to resource-rich worlds for months. "The shuttle bay is ready for departure." "Ma'am," announced the ship's AI through the intercom, "Zephyrian escort vessels have taken flanking positions." Through the porthole, Marcus could see the sleek, organic curves of the alien ships. They looked more like living creatures than vessels, their biomechanical hulls shifting and pulsing with an inner light. Each one was easily 3 times the size of the human transport. "Remember, Sergeant," Walsh said as they prepared to board the shuttle, "we're here to negotiate, not to fight." The Galactic Council specifically requested that both sides bring minimal military presence. Marcus adjusted his dress uniform and checked his sidearm one final time. "With respect, ma'am, in my experience, the best negotiations happen when everyone knows exactly what they're dealing with." The shuttle ride to the surface was tense and silent. Their pilot, a nervous young ensign named Torres, kept glancing at his instruments as if expecting the Zephyrian escorts to open fire at any moment. The alien ships maintained their formation with mechanical precision. Their weapon systems powered but not locked on. The landing site was a vast plateau overlooking one of the planet's major canyon systems. A temporary structure had been erected for the negotiations, its design a blend of human and Zephyrian architecture that somehow managed to look both impressive and uncomfortable. The building's walls were transparent, offering a panoramic view of the hostile landscape beyond. As they disembarked, Marcus immediately noticed the Zephyrian delegation waiting for them. There were 12 of them, tall and imposing figures in elaborate ceremonial armor. Their leader stood at the center, easily recognizable by the additional bioluminescent markings on his armor and the ceremonial weapon at his side. "That's War Commander Vex High," Walsh whispered. "He's the one we'll be dealing with. The intelligence reports say he's never lost a battle and has little patience for what he calls inferior species." The Zephyrians were impressive specimens, standing nearly 8 feet tall with elongated limbs and angular features. Their skin had a metallic sheen, and their eyes glowed with an inner light that made them appear almost demonic in certain lighting. They moved with fluid grace, each step calculated and precise. Behind the war commander stood his personal guard, elite soldiers whose armor was darker and more angular than their leaders. These were the Zephyrian equivalent of special forces, warriors who had proven themselves in countless battles across the galaxy. Each one carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. As the human delegation approached the meeting structure, Marcus felt the weight of alien eyes upon him. The Zephyrians were studying them, analyzing their movements, their equipment, their body language. He had faced enemy forces before, but never ones that seemed so coldly analytical about the process. "Stay close and follow my lead," Walsh murmured. "And whatever happens, don't react to any provocations." The meeting chamber was stark and functional, with a large table in the center and chairs designed to accommodate both species. The lighting was harsh and clinical, casting sharp shadows across the room. Through the transparent walls, the alien landscape stretched endlessly, a constant reminder of how far from home they were. War Commander Vexhai entered the chamber with his retinue, his movements fluid and predatory. When he spoke, his voice was a melodic but cold sound that the translation devices struggled to convey properly. "So," he said, his glowing eyes fixed on Walsh, "the humans have sent another delegation to beg for scraps from our table. How predictable." Walsh maintained her diplomatic composure, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. "War Commander, we come seeking a mutually beneficial arrangement. The Proxima Centauri system has resources that could benefit both our species." Vexahai's laugh was like the sound of crystal breaking. "Benefit? You speak as if you have something to offer in return. Your species is young, primitive, and weak. What could you possibly provide that we do not already possess?" The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt his hand twitch involuntarily toward his sidearm, a motion that did not go unnoticed by the Zephyrian guards. Their own weapons shifted slightly, energy cells beginning to glow with increased intensity. "We offer partnership," Walsh replied carefully. "Human innovation combined with Zephyrian technology could achieve things neither of us could accomplish alone." "Innovation?" Vexhai leaned back in his chair, his expression amused. "You mean your crude attempts at reverse engineering our technology? Your fumbling efforts to understand forces that we have mastered for millennia?" The war commander stood and began pacing around the table, his movements hypnotic and threatening. "Let me explain something about the reality of this galaxy, human. There are those who rule and there are those who serve. Your species has exactly two choices: accept your place as a client race under our protection, or face the consequences of your presumption." Marcus watched the alien's performance with growing interest rather than intimidation. He had seen this before, the calculated display of dominance meant to break an opponent's will before negotiations even began. It was effective against most species, but humans had their own particular way of responding to threats. The war commander stopped directly in front of Walsh, towering over her seated form. "The Proxima Centauri system will remain under Zephyrian control. Your colonies will withdraw, and your ships will not enter our space without explicit permission. These are not negotiating points. These are facts." Walsh's diplomatic training kept her voice level, but Marcus could hear the steel underneath. "And if we refuse?" War Commander Vexhai's eyes blazed brighter at Walsh's question, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. His guards shifted into more aggressive stances, their weapons now humming audibly with contained energy. "Refuse?" The word rolled off his tongue like a curse. "Your species seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding about your position in this galaxy. Allow me to clarify." He gestured toward one of his guards, who immediately stepped forward and activated a holographic display. The image showed star charts of human space, with red markers indicating every major colony, space station, and military installation. "We know the location of every human settlement. We have mapped your trade routes, cataloged your military assets, and analyzed your defensive capabilities." Vexhai's voice carried the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. "Your entire civilization exists at our sufferance." Marcus studied the display with professional interest. The intelligence was accurate, which meant the Zephyrians had been conducting surveillance operations in human space for months, possibly years. But what struck him was not the thoroughness of their intelligence gathering, but what it revealed about their tactical thinking. They were planning for conquest, not negotiation. "You see," Vexhai continued, "your species has developed under the delusion that you are the masters of your own destiny. This is a common mistake among emerging civilizations. You build your ships, establish your colonies, and imagine that these achievements make you significant in the broader scope of galactic affairs." The war commander moved to another section of the holographic display, showing comparative military strength. The numbers were sobering. The Zephyrian hegemony possessed nearly 10 times the number of warships. Their technology was generations ahead, and their experience in interstellar warfare spanned millennia. "The reality," Vexhai said, his voice taking on an almost educational tone, "is that you are children playing with forces you do not comprehend. Your weapons are crude, your tactics are primitive, and your understanding of galactic warfare is laughably inadequate." Walsh maintained her composure, but Marcus could see the calculations running behind her eyes. She was a skilled diplomat, but even she had to recognize the mathematical impossibility of the situation they faced. However, the war commander continued, "We are not without mercy. The Zephyrian hegemony has always been magnanimous toward species that recognize their proper place in the natural order. Accept client status and your people will enjoy our protection. Your scientists will be permitted to study under our guidance. Your workers will contribute to projects of true galactic significance." "And our autonomy?" Walsh asked quietly. Vexhi's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if it weren't so cold. "Autonomy is a luxury afforded only to those with the power to enforce it. Your species lacks that power. Therefore, you lack that right." One of the Zephyrian guards, a particularly imposing specimen with scars across his armor, stepped closer to the human delegation. His weapon was now fully charged, casting an eerie blue glow across his angular features. "Perhaps," the guard said, his voice a lower, more gravelly version of his commander's melodic tone. "The humans require a more direct demonstration of our resolve." Marcus felt rather than saw the subtle shift in the room's dynamics. What had been a negotiation was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The Zephyrian guards were no longer simply present for ceremony. They were preparing for action. "Sub-Commander Kreltok raises an excellent point," Vexhi said, nodding approvingly at his subordinate. "Words alone seem insufficient to convey the gravity of your situation." The sub-commander moved closer to Marcus, his weapon now aimed directly at the Marine's chest. "This one," he said, his glowing eyes fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity. "He has the look of a warrior. Perhaps if we remove him from the equation, the others will be more amenable to reason." Marcus looked up at the towering alien, noting the confidence in his stance, the casual way he held his weapon, the assumption of easy dominance written in every line of his body language. It was a look he had seen before, in the eyes of enemies who believed their superior firepower made them invincible. "You will order your military forces to begin immediate withdrawal from disputed territories," Kreltok continued, his weapon's energy output increasing. "Or I will demonstrate the consequences of human stubbornness using your soldier as an example." Walsh started to speak, but Marcus raised a hand slightly, stopping her. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but it carried weight. He had made a decision. "Sub-Commander," Marcus said, his voice calm and conversational as he looked up at the alien towering over him. "Before you do anything permanent, I think there's something you should understand about humans." Kreltok's weapon didn't waver, but his expression showed a flicker of curiosity. "And what wisdom could a primitive species possibly offer to enlighten us?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed despite the weapon pointed at his chest. His response would have to be carefully calibrated. Too aggressive and he would precipitate the very conflict they were trying to avoid. Too passive and he would confirm every assumption the Zephyrians had about human weakness. "The thing about us humans," Marcus said, a slight smile beginning to play at the corners of his mouth, "is that we have a really strange relationship with overwhelming odds." The alien's eyes narrowed, and his finger moved closer to the weapon's trigger mechanism. "Explain." "Well, see, most species in this galaxy seem to think that superior numbers and better technology automatically determine the outcome of a conflict. It's a reasonable assumption, really. Very logical." Marcus's smile widened slightly. "But humans? We have this weird habit of treating impossible situations as challenges rather than death sentences." Vexhi was watching this exchange with growing interest. This was not the reaction he had expected from the human military representative. Fear, certainly. Anger, possibly. But this calm amusement was something entirely unexpected. "You think your warrior's bravado will somehow alter the fundamental mathematics of power?" the war commander asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not bravado, sir. History." He gestured casually toward the holographic display still showing the comparative military strengths. "See, every one of those numbers represents something that someone said was impossible for humans to achieve." The room had grown very quiet. Even the Zephyrian guard seemed to be paying attention to what the human was saying. "Impossible to leave our homeworld. Impossible to survive in space. Impossible to travel between stars. Impossible to establish colonies on hostile worlds." Marcus enumerated each point on his fingers. "And yet here we are, having this conversation on an alien world, light years from where we started." Kreltok's weapon remained trained on Marcus, but his expression had shifted. The casual confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of uncertainty. The thing is, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a storytelling cadence, humans have this really annoying tendency to do the impossible when someone tells them they can't. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Kreltok spoke again, his voice carrying a note of impatience. Your species' delusional self-assessment is irrelevant to current reality. You face extinction and you respond with stories. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right about the stories part. We are definitely a species that loves our stories. But here's the interesting thing about human stories. He leaned forward slightly, his movement so casual that it didn't even register as aggressive. They have this weird habit of becoming reality. Vexhai stepped closer to the conversation, his scientific curiosity overriding his diplomatic protocol. Elaborate. Well, take our most popular stories. David versus Goliath, The Alamo, Thermopylae, Rourke's Drift. Every single one of them involves humans facing impossible odds and doing something completely unreasonable in response. Marcus's smile had taken on an almost philosophical quality. The funny thing is, we keep telling those stories because they keep happening. The sub-commander's weapon was still trained on Marcus, but his stance had shifted slightly. He was no longer simply pointing a weapon. He was listening to something that challenged his understanding of his opponents. Your historical examples prove our point, Kreltok said. In each case, the smaller force was ultimately destroyed or defeated. Were they? Marcus asked, tilting his head slightly. Because last I checked, we're still here. Still expanding. Still finding new ways to do things everyone else says are impossible. He gestured toward the transparent walls showing the alien landscape beyond. Still showing up at diplomatic meetings on alien worlds, discussing terms with species that supposedly outclass us in every measurable way. Walsh was watching this exchange with growing fascination and concern. This was not the direction she had anticipated for the negotiations, but she recognized that Marcus was operating according to some plan she didn't fully understand. The Spartan king Leonidas at Thermopylae faced the largest army ever assembled in human history. When told that the Persian arrows would block out the sun, do you know what he said? Marcus paused for effect. He said, "Good, then we'll fight in the shade." The Zephyrians exchanged glances. This was clearly not the response pattern they had expected from a species they considered primitive. The defenders of the Alamo were facing an army 50 times their size. They could have surrendered. They could have fled. Instead, they drew a line in the sand and dared their enemies to cross it. Marcus's voice had taken on an edge that hadn't been there before. Every man who stayed knew he was going to die. Every single one of them chose to fight anyway. Vexhai's expression had shifted from amused condescension to something more analytical. You speak of glorious defeats as if they were victories. Do I? Marcus asked. Because the way I see it, every one of those defeats taught my species something valuable about ourselves. They taught us that superior numbers don't guarantee victory. They taught us that the will to fight can overcome technological disadvantages. Most importantly, they taught us that some things are worth dying for. The energy weapon in Kreltok's hands hummed with increased intensity, but Marcus seemed completely unperturbed by its presence. But here's the really interesting part, Marcus continued. Those weren't even our best examples. Those were just the warm-up acts. You want to know what humans do when we really get serious about fighting? The room had become charged with an almost electric tension. Every being present understood that this conversation had moved far beyond diplomatic protocol and into something much more primal. We adapt, Marcus said simply. We study our enemies. We learn from our mistakes. We find their weaknesses and exploit them. And most importantly, we never ever stop fighting until the job is done. He stood up slowly, his movement fluid and controlled, despite the weapon tracking his every motion. Take our Second World War. We were attacked by surprise, our fleet was crippled, and we were facing enemies on two fronts who had been preparing for conflict for years. Everyone expected us to negotiate a peace settlement. Marcus began walking slowly around the table, his casual movement forcing the Zephyrian guards to adjust their positions to keep him in sight. Instead, we built the largest military-industrial complex in history. We developed weapons that could level cities. We fought battles on 6 continents and across 3 oceans simultaneously, and when it was over, Our enemies' capitals were smoking ruins and their governments were unconditionally surrendering. Vexhai was now studying, Marcus with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Your point being? My point, Marcus said, stopping directly in front of Kreltok, looking up at the alien who still had a weapon aimed at his chest, is that you're making the same mistake everyone else has made about humans. You're assuming that our current capabilities represent our maximum potential. The sub-commander's finger tightened on his weapon's trigger mechanism. Your potential is irrelevant. Your current reality is that you are outgunned, outnumbered, and outclassed. Marcus's smile widened into something that was both genuinely amused and deeply unsettling. Sub-commander, you're absolutely right about all of those things. Right now, at this moment, your forces could probably crush human civilization if you really committed to it. The admission seemed to satisfy something in Kreltok's demeanor. His stance relaxed slightly, and the weapon's energy output decreased marginally. But, Marcus continued, his voice carrying a note of genuine enthusiasm, you're forgetting something really important about impossible situations, which is, they have a tendency to bring out the absolute worst in human behavior. The smile never left Marcus's face, but something cold had crept into his eyes. And trust me, Sub-Commander, you really don't want to see what humans are capable of when we stop being polite. Kreltok's weapon came back to full charge, and his stance shifted into a more aggressive configuration. Are you threatening us, human? Marcus shook his head. Not at all. I'm just pointing out that you're approaching this situation with incomplete information. He gestured casually toward the holographic display, still showing comparative military strengths. All of those numbers you're so proud of? They assume that humans will continue to play by the current rules of engagement. The room had gone completely silent except for the humming of alien weapons and the distant sound of wind across the hostile landscape outside. Let me ask you a question, Sub-Commander, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the tone of someone discussing a purely academic subject. In all of your intelligence gathering about human capabilities, did anyone think to study what happens when we decide that the rules no longer apply? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus could see the gears turning behind Kreltok's glowing eyes. The sub-commander's weapon remained trained on him, but there was now a note of uncertainty in the alien's posture. Explain, Vexhai commanded, his scientific curiosity clearly overriding his diplomatic obligations. Marcus nodded appreciatively. See, most species approach warfare as an extension of politics. Clausewitz called it politics by other means, very civilized, very rational. Rules of engagement, laws of war, acceptable losses, strategic objectives. He paused, letting the concept settle. Humans understand that approach. We even prefer it most of the time. He began walking again, this time moving toward the transparent wall overlooking the alien landscape. The binary suns cast strange shadows across the crystalline formations, creating an almost hypnotic pattern of light and darkness. But sometimes, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a contemplative quality, humans decide that civilization is a luxury we can't afford. That's when things get interesting. Walsh was beginning to understand where Marcus was heading with this, and she wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction. But she also recognized that conventional diplomacy had already failed. Perhaps unconventional approaches were their only remaining option. During our Second World War, the Japanese thought they understood American capabilities. They had studied our military, analyzed our industrial capacity, evaluated our willingness to sustain casualties. They made their attack based on rational calculations. Marcus turned back to face the Zephyrians. What they didn't account for was what happens when Americans decide that the gloves are coming off. Kreltok's weapon tracked Marcus's movement, but the alien was clearly listening intently. Continue. We turned our entire civilian economy into a war machine overnight. Every factory, every laboratory, every research facility was suddenly devoted to finding new and creative ways to kill our enemies. We developed weapons that had never been imagined before, tactics that had never been tried, and strategies that violated every accepted principle of civilized warfare. Marcus gestured toward the holographic display. Your intelligence shows our current military capabilities, but it doesn't show what happens when human scientists start working around the clock to solve the problem of how to kill aliens more efficiently. The room's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a diplomatic meeting was now something resembling a military briefing. with Marcus as the instructor explaining the fundamental principles of human warfare to an audience of confused and increasingly concerned aliens. "Take our nuclear weapons program," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone discussing a particularly fascinating engineering problem. "We went from first successful atomic test to deployed weapons that could level entire cities in less than 3 years. 3 years. And that was using 1940s technology." Vexhai leaned forward slightly. "Your point being?" "My point is that was just the beginning. Once we proved the concept worked, we started getting creative." Marcus's smile had taken on an almost predatory quality. "Fusion bombs that were 1,000 times more powerful. Neutron bombs that could kill every living thing in a city while leaving the buildings intact. Cobalt bombs that could poison entire continents for centuries." The Zephyrians were exchanging glances again, and Marcus could see that his words were having an effect. These were beings accustomed to technological superiority, and the idea that a primitive species might rapidly develop advanced weapons was clearly disturbing. "But nuclear weapons were just the obvious solution," Marcus continued. "Humans have this annoying habit of exploring every possible avenue of destruction once we commit to a conflict. Biological weapons, chemical weapons, cyber warfare, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence." He paused, letting that last point sink in. "We've already developed AI systems that can outthink human strategists. What do you think happens when we point those systems at the problem of defeating a technologically superior enemy?" Kreltalk's weapon was still aimed at Marcus, but the sub-commander's stance had shifted. He was no longer casually confident. He was actively evaluating a potential threat. "You speak of theoretical capabilities," Vexhai said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "Do I?" Marcus asked. "Because from where I'm standing, the only thing theoretical about human military potential is how much we're willing to hold back to maintain the pretense of civilization." He moved closer to Kreltalk, bringing himself within arm's reach of the alien's weapon. The gesture was either supremely confident or utterly suicidal, and everyone in the room understood that the distinction was largely academic. "Let me tell you what happens when humans decide to stop holding back," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the quiet intensity of someone sharing classified information. "We stop thinking about acceptable casualties and start thinking about total victory. We stop worrying about collateral damage and start focusing on maximum effectiveness. We stop following the rules and start writing new ones." The energy weapon in Kreltalk's hands was now humming at maximum charge, its blue glow casting eerie shadows across both their faces. "During the Vietnam War, we developed Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant designed to remove jungle cover. Later, we discovered it could cause cancer, birth defects, and genetic damage that lasted for generations. Do you know what our response was when we learned about the long-term effects?" Marcus paused, his eyes locked on Kreltalk's glowing gaze. "We didn't stop using it. We started developing more effective versions." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Even Walsh looked disturbed by the direction of Marcus's exposition. "But that was just a police action," Marcus continued relentlessly. "We were still trying to be civilized. We were still following international law and worrying about public opinion. Imagine what happens when we decide that alien invaders don't deserve those considerations." Vexhai stood up from his chair, his full height making him an imposing figure, even in a room full of warriors. "You are describing war crimes, not military strategy." Marcus's laugh was genuinely amused. "War crimes? Sub-Commander. War crimes are things you do to other humans who share your legal framework and moral assumptions. What legal protections do you think apply when humanity is fighting for its survival against alien conquerors?" The question was delivered with such casual matter-of-factness that it took several seconds for its implications to fully register with the Zephyrian delegation. "You see," Marcus continued, "your entire strategic calculation is based on the assumption that humans will continue to operate within the constraints of civilized behavior. But civilization is a choice, not an inevitability. And when faced with extinction, humans have historically been very willing to make different choices." Kreltalk's finger was now hovering directly over his weapon's trigger, and Marcus could see the alien wrestling with a decision that had suddenly become much more complex than he had anticipated. "So here's my question for you, Sub-Commander," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of someone proposing an interesting thought experiment. "Are you really prepared for what happens next?" The question reverberated through the chamber like a physical force. Kreltok's weapon remained trained on Marcus, but the alien's entire demeanor had changed. What had begun as a casual display of dominance had transformed into something much more complex and dangerous. "What I am prepared for," Kreltok said slowly, "is to eliminate a threat before it can metastasize." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Now that's interesting military thinking. Strike first, ask questions later. Very practical." He tilted his head slightly, studying the alien warrior with professional interest. "But you're still operating under the assumption that eliminating me eliminates the threat." The sub-commander's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Well, see, that's where human warfare gets really interesting," Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost educational tone. "Most species think in terms of hierarchical command structures. Remove the leadership and the organization collapses. Very logical approach." He gestured casually toward Walsh, who was watching this exchange with growing fascination and alarm. "You probably assume that if you kill the military representative, the diplomat will be more amenable to negotiation. Standard intimidation protocol." Vexai was listening intently, his scientific curiosity clearly engaged despite the increasingly dangerous situation. "But humans," Marcus continued, "have this really annoying habit of treating martyrdom as a force multiplier rather than a deterrent." The room's atmosphere had become charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. Every being present understood that they were balanced on a knife's edge between diplomacy and warfare. "You kill me here, Sub-Commander, and what do you think happens back on Earth?" Marcus's smile had taken on a predatory quality that made even the heavily armed alien slightly uncomfortable. "Do you think my government apologizes and accepts client status? Do you think my people decide that resistance is futile?" Kreltok's weapon hummed with barely contained energy, but his expression showed the first real uncertainty he had displayed since the meeting began. "I'll tell you what happens," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the quiet intensity of someone delivering a military briefing. "Every human military strategist, weapons designer, and research scientist suddenly has a very personal reason to find ways to kill Zephyrians more effectively." He began walking again, forcing the alien guards to constantly adjust their positions to maintain sight lines. The movement was calculated to demonstrate that he was not intimidated by their weapons, while simultaneously creating tactical complications for them. "See, you've made a fundamental error in your threat assessment," Marcus continued. "You've assumed that human military capability is limited by our current technology and our current willingness to use extreme measures. But both of those parameters change dramatically when you give us an existential threat to focus on." Walsh finally found her voice. "Sergeant, perhaps we should return to diplomatic solutions." Marcus shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, I think we're past that point. The sub-commander has made it clear that diplomacy was never really an option. They brought us here to deliver an ultimatum, not to negotiate." He turned back to Kreltok, whose weapon was now tracking his every movement with mechanical precision. "The question now is whether they're prepared for the consequences of their ultimatum." Vexai stepped closer to the conversation. "You speak as if humanity has hidden capabilities that our intelligence has failed to detect." "Not hidden," Marcus corrected. "Just not yet developed. See, that's the thing about humans that most species don't understand. Our greatest military advantage isn't what we have right now. It's how quickly we can adapt when someone gives us a reason to." The holographic display was still showing the comparative military strengths, but Marcus could see that the Zephyrians were beginning to view those numbers with less confidence than they had at the beginning of the meeting. "During our Cold War, we went from having no space program to putting men on the moon in less than a decade. Why? Because the Soviets challenged us to a space race. Competition made us innovative in ways that peaceful progress never could have achieved." Marcus gestured toward the display. "You're looking at human military capabilities as if they're static, as if what we have today is what we'll have tomorrow. But that's not how humans work. Give us an enemy to focus on, and we become very creative very quickly." Kreltok's stance had shifted again. He was no longer simply pointing a weapon. He was evaluating a tactical situation that had become much more complex than anticipated. "Take our internet," Marcus continued relentlessly. "Originally developed as a military communication system that could survive nuclear war, we turned it into a global information network that connects every human on the planet in real time. Now imagine what happens when we dedicate that entire network to the single problem of defeating alien invaders. The implications were starting to register with the Zephyrian delegation. A species that could coordinate global resources in real time could potentially overcome technological disadvantages through sheer volume of innovation and production. Or consider our genetic engineering capabilities, Marcus said, his voice taking on an almost casual tone that made his words even more disturbing. We're already modifying crops and livestock. We're developing gene therapies for diseases. How long do you think it would take us to start modifying humans for enhanced combat performance? Vexhi's expression had shifted from amused condescension to something resembling genuine concern. You speak of abominations. I speak of adaptation, Marcus replied. Humans who can survive in vacuum. Humans who can see in different light spectra. Humans who can process information faster, react quicker, coordinate more effectively. He paused, letting the concept settle. Humans who are specifically designed to kill aliens. The energy weapon in Kreltok's hands was now at maximum charge, its blue glow filling the chamber with eerie light. But the alien's expression showed that he was wrestling with implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. But here's the really interesting part, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the tone of someone sharing a particularly fascinating secret. All of those capabilities I've described? They're just the conventional approaches. They're what humans do when we're still trying to be reasonable. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Even the sound of wind across the alien landscape seemed muted by the tension in the room. You want to know what happens when humans stop being reasonable? Marcus asked, his smile widening into something that was both genuinely amused and deeply unsettling. We start thinking outside the box in ways that make civilized species very, very uncomfortable. Kreltok's finger was now trembling slightly on his weapon's trigger. The sub-commander was clearly struggling with a decision that had implications far beyond the immediate confrontation. So I'll ask you again. Sub-commander, Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had already calculated the odds and found them acceptable. Are you really prepared for what happens next? The weapon's energy output fluctuated slightly, and Marcus could see that Kreltok was caught between his orders, his instincts, and his growing understanding of the true nature of the species he was threatening. Because once you pull that trigger, Marcus continued softly, there's no going back. And I promise you, Sub-Commander, you really don't want to find out what humans are capable of when we decide that alien life has no value whatsoever. The chamber fell into absolute silence. The only sounds were the humming of alien weapons and the distant whisper of wind across the crystalline formations outside. Kreltok's weapon remained trained on Marcus, but the alien's posture had shifted from confident aggression to something resembling cautious evaluation. Marcus could see the calculations running behind the sub-commander's glowing eyes. This was a warrior who had spent centuries perfecting the art of intimidation, and he was discovering that his usual methods were not only ineffective, but potentially counterproductive. You think your threats will somehow alter the fundamental mathematics of this situation? Kreltok finally said, but his voice lacked the casual confidence it had carried earlier. Threats? Marcus shook his head, his expression genuinely puzzled. Sub-Commander, I haven't made any threats. I've been providing intelligence briefings about human behavioral patterns under extreme stress. There's a difference. He gestured toward the holographic display. You've shown me your analysis of current human capabilities. I'm simply pointing out that your dataset is incomplete. You're predicting future human behavior based on past human limitations, but you're not accounting for what happens when those limitations are removed by necessity. Vexhi had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. As a military strategist, he could appreciate the implications of what the human was saying, even if he didn't entirely believe it. You suggest that human military potential is somehow unlimited? The war commander asked. Not unlimited, Marcus corrected, but dramatically underestimated. See, most species develop their military capabilities gradually, through incremental improvements over generations. Humans tend to make quantum leaps when we're properly motivated. He began walking toward the transparent wall again, his movement casual despite the weapons tracking him. Take our development of atomic weapons. The theoretical physics had existed for decades, but nobody thought it was practically achievable. Then we found ourselves in an existential conflict, and suddenly the impossible became inevitable. In less than 5 years. Marcus paused at the wall, looking out at the alien landscape. The binary suns were setting, casting strange shadows across the crystalline formations and turning the sky an ominous shade of purple. Or consider our development of rocket technology. We went from barely being able to launch objects into orbit to landing on the moon in 10 years. Not because it was easy, but because we decided it was necessary. He turned back to face the Zephyrian delegation. The pattern is consistent throughout human history. When we're comfortable, we innovate slowly. When we're threatened, we innovate at a pace that surprises even ourselves. Kreltok's weapon was still charged, but Marcus could see uncertainty creeping into the alien's stance. This was not the response pattern the sub-commander had been trained to expect from an inferior species. But innovation takes time, Vexai pointed out. Our forces could crush human civilization before your species had time to develop countermeasures. Marcus nodded appreciatively. That's absolutely true. If you committed to total war right now, you could probably win through sheer overwhelming force. The question is whether you could win before we made the cost unacceptable. The room's atmosphere had shifted again. What had begun as a threat display was now resembling a strategic planning session, with both sides analyzing the potential costs and benefits of different courses of action. During World War II, the Japanese could have won a decisive victory if they had followed up their attack on Pearl Harbor with an invasion of the American mainland. They had the naval superiority, they had the element of surprise, and they had experienced troops. Marcus's voice took on the tone of someone discussing historical inevitabilities, but they hesitated, and hesitation gave us time to recover and adapt. Walsh was watching this exchange with growing understanding. Marcus wasn't trying to intimidate the aliens with threats of retaliation. He was conducting a cost-benefit analysis of warfare and presenting it in terms that military strategists could appreciate. The lesson, Marcus continued, is that when you're fighting humans, you don't get to have a limited war. You either win quickly and decisively, or you find yourself locked into a conflict that becomes progressively more expensive and destructive for everyone involved. Kreltok's weapon finally wavered slightly. You speak as if human defeat would somehow constitute victory. Would it? Marcus asked. Let's say you destroy every human military installation, occupy every human world, and kill every human who resists. What do you think happens next? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Even the Zephyrian guard seemed to be paying attention to the answer. You'd have to garrison every human world permanently. You'd have to monitor every human scientific facility to prevent weapons development. You'd have to suppress every human cultural institution that might inspire resistance. Marcus enumerated each point carefully. Essentially, you'd have to dedicate a significant portion of your military resources to permanent occupation duty. Vexai was nodding slowly, his strategic mind clearly engaging with the implications. But even that wouldn't be enough, Marcus continued, because humans have this annoying habit of passing resistance movements from generation to generation. Your children would inherit the occupation. So would their children, and their children's children. He gestured toward the display showing Zephyrian military strength. All of those impressive numbers would become much less impressive when they're scattered across dozens of human worlds, trying to maintain control over a population that views them as alien invaders. Kreltok's weapon was still trained on Marcus, but the alien's expression showed that he was grappling with strategic implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. And that's assuming, Marcus said, his voice taking on a more contemplative tone, that the other species in this galaxy are comfortable with the precedent you'd be setting. The observation struck the chamber like a physical blow. For the first time since the meeting began, the Zephyrians looked genuinely uncomfortable. See, right now, most species probably view the human-Zephyrian conflict as a local dispute between two relatively minor powers. But if you commit genocide against an entire species just because they refuse to accept client status, Marcus shook his head. That changes the entire political dynamic of the galaxy. Walsh was beginning to understand the full scope of what Marcus was attempting. He wasn't just threatening retaliation. He was outlining the strategic implications of the choices the Zephyrians were contemplating. Suddenly, every other species in the galaxy has to ask themselves, are we next? If humans can be exterminated for refusing to submit, what's to stop the Zephyrians from making similar demands on everyone else? Vexai's expression had shifted to something resembling genuine concern. As a military strategist, he could see the logic of the argument. and its implications were troubling. You're suggesting that our conflict with humanity could destabilize the entire galactic political order, the war commander said. Marcus smiled. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply pointing out that actions have consequences, and those consequences extend far beyond the immediate participants. The energy weapon in Kreltalk's hands finally began to power down, its blue glow fading to a dull amber. The sub-commander was clearly struggling with a decision that had become much more complex than he had anticipated. So what do you propose? Vexhai asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than condescension. Marcus's smile widened into something that was both diplomatic and predatory. I propose that we reconsider the assumptions that brought us to this point. The chamber fell silent as Marcus's words settled over the assembled delegates. Kreltalk's weapon had powered down to standby status, though it remained in his hands. The immediate threat of violence had passed, replaced by something far more complex and potentially more dangerous, the beginning of actual negotiation. Reconsider our assumptions, Vexhai repeated slowly, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications. Elaborate. Marcus moved away from the transparent wall and back toward the conference table, his movement casual but purposeful. Well, your fundamental assumption seems to be that superior technology and numbers automatically translate to inevitable victory. That's certainly been true in your previous conflicts. He gestured toward the holographic display still showing comparative military strengths. But every one of those conflicts was against species that thought and fought in predictable ways. Species that had established military doctrines, conventional tactics, and rational strategic objectives. Walsh was watching this exchange with growing admiration. Marcus had somehow managed to transform what should have been a massacre into a strategic planning session, using the aliens' own analytical nature against their assumptions about human capabilities. Humans, Marcus continued, have a documented history of abandoning conventional approaches when they prove inadequate. We don't just adapt our tactics. We fundamentally alter our understanding of what warfare means. Kreltalk holstered his weapon but remained standing, his posture alert and ready. You speak as if your species possesses some unique military advantage. We do, Marcus said simply. We're completely unreasonable. The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that it took several seconds for its full meaning to register with the alien delegation. Most species approach warfare as an extension of politics, Marcus explained. They fight for territory, resources, political advantage. They calculate acceptable losses and strategic objectives. They follow established rules of engagement. He paused, looking each of the Zephyrians in the eye. Humans fight for principles, and when we're fighting for principles, the normal calculations don't apply. Vexhai leaned forward, his interest clearly engaged. Explain this distinction. When you're fighting for territory, you can negotiate boundaries. When you're fighting for resources, you can discuss distribution. When you're fighting for political advantage, you can make deals. Marcus's voice took on an almost philosophical quality. But when you're fighting for the right to exist as a free species, there's nothing left to negotiate. The room's atmosphere had transformed completely. What had begun as an ultimatum delivery had evolved into something resembling a strategic seminar, with Marcus as the instructor explaining human warfare to an audience of fascinated and increasingly concerned alien military theorists. During our American Civil War, the Confederacy thought they were fighting for states' rights and economic independence. The Union decided they were fighting to preserve the fundamental principle that no nation could survive half slave and half free. Marcus gestured expansively. Once it became a conflict about principles rather than politics, compromise became impossible. Walsh finally saw the full scope of what Marcus had accomplished. He had taken the Zephyrians' threat of extermination and transformed it into a discussion about the nature of human warfare, forcing them to confront the implications of their ultimatum from a strategic rather than tactical perspective. The result, Marcus continued, was that the Union didn't just fight to win. They fought to utterly destroy the Confederacy's ability to continue existing as a separate entity. Totalva. Complete surrender. No negotiated settlement. Kreltalk had been listening intently, and his expression showed that he was beginning to grasp the implications for any conflict with humanity. You're suggesting that any war between our species would inevitably escalate to total warfare. The Sub-Commander said. I'm not suggesting it, Marcus corrected. I'm guaranteeing it. Once you make this about human survival rather than human compliance, you've crossed a line that fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict. Vexhai stood and began pacing, his movements reflecting deep thought rather than agitation. But surely rational beings can find alternatives to mutual destruction. Absolutely, Marcus agreed enthusiastically. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. The response clearly surprised the Zephyrians, who had expected continued threats rather than diplomatic optimism. See, the thing about humans is that we actually prefer cooperation to conflict when it's offered as a genuine alternative. We're innovative, adaptable, and we learn quickly. We could be valuable allies rather than problematic subjects. Marcus moved to the holographic display and began manipulating the controls, changing the view from comparative military strengths to galactic resource distribution. Look at this from a different perspective, he said, highlighting various star systems. Instead of viewing human expansion as a threat to Zephyrian dominance, consider it as an opportunity for mutual benefit. Walsh seized the opening, her diplomatic training finally finding purchase in the conversation. Human colonial techniques could open worlds that are currently considered uninhabitable. Our industrial capacity could supplement Zephyrian manufacturing. Our scientific creativity could accelerate technological development. Vexhai studied the new display with obvious interest. Continue. Partnership instead of dominance, Marcus said simply. Mutual defense instead of client states. Shared exploration instead of territorial competition. The war commander's expression showed that he was evaluating these concepts with the same analytical intensity he had applied to military calculations. But such an arrangement would require acknowledging human sovereignty, Kreltalk pointed out. Our previous experiences with client species suggest that independence inevitably leads to conflict. Because you've never tried it with humans, Marcus replied. Every other species you've dealt with was already established in their thinking patterns when you encountered them. Humans are still figuring out how galactic civilization works. We could develop our interstellar culture in ways that complement rather than compete with Zephyrian interests. The room had fallen silent again, but this time the silence was contemplative rather than threatening. Both sides were clearly evaluating possibilities that had not existed when the meeting began. Of course, Marcus said, his voice taking on a more casual tone. This all assumes that both sides are interested in exploring alternatives to the original ultimatum. Vexhai's expression shifted, and for the first time since the meeting began, he looked genuinely uncertain about the path forward. You have given us much to consider, the war commander said finally. Perhaps the situation is more complex than our initial analysis suggested. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, the expression carried genuine warmth rather than predatory confidence. Sub-Commander, sometimes the most important military intelligence is knowing when not to fight a war in the first place. Kreltalk's stance relaxed completely for the first time since the meeting began. Your species continues to surprise us, human. That, Marcus replied, is exactly the point. We're full of surprises, and most of them are much more pleasant when we're working together, instead of against each other. As the binary suns finally set behind the crystalline formations outside, casting the chamber in the soft glow of emergency lighting, both delegations found themselves contemplating a future that neither had anticipated when the day began. The ultimatum that had brought them together was forgotten, replaced by possibilities that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. And Marcus Chen, United States Marine, sat back in his chair with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just prevented a war by refusing to be intimidated by impossible odds.